legal significance. And what I intend to do is to explain to you a little bit how we see it, and also, like in the previous session, to have an interaction with you, to deepen issues which may be of interest for you, and you can also challenge, of course, my views when you think something needs to be added or criticized. EU as a whole, we have 140 delegations all around the world, so a little bit like state embassies. And out of those, 51 are across Africa. And we also have a delegation directly in the African Union, so in Addis Ababa since 2008. And that underlines a little bit the importance of the African Union for the EU. We operate a self-standing embassy at the EU, such as, comparably, we would have an embassy at the UN in New York. Let me tell you a little bit how I intend to go through the lecture. So first we have a bit of a historical background in the objectives of EU-AU partnership. And then the main part, and also the most legal one, I would say, is to go through the priorities. And that we are going to study by looking at the last joint declaration of 2025, which I then invite you also to look at your screen on the internet, and then we go through and try to understand what the joint declaration as such is, but also the concepts it refers to. There are a lot of, let's say, references to other concepts, strategies, or instruments, and I want to unpack that together with you, that we understand what is meant by all those kind of references. And then finally, after the 4 key priorities, I also want to address some issues which may be a bit more controversial, which you may not find in the declaration, but which are also important to understand our relationship. So that brings me to first part, the foundation of African and European partnership. What is interesting to note here is, Judge Pladi already mentioned, we have, of course, the predecessor of the African Union since '63, and then in 2000 African Union was established, which really created a new organization with a new impetus, broader powers and so on. And almost immediately there was an understanding that this African Union should also reach out to the European Union. So in the very same year, in 2000, there was already the first EU-Africa summit in Cairo, and which tells you something. If you want to choose your friends, you maybe visit them first. That's what every new government does. A new PM is voted, and then we see to which foreign country does he go first. Here, African Union and Europe agreed to have a summit already in April 2000. And then we took a little bit of time to have a second summit, 2007, followed by summits in 2010, 2014, and 2017. And as I said, which is the most important one, is the last 2 ones. There was one in Brussels, and the latest was happening here on the African continent, which is then for us the current program when we want to look at the state of affairs. How can the interaction occur? At what level? What would you say if African Union wants to talk to the European Union? Who's that in real terms? Are those ministers or ambassadors or heads of state? What do you think? Anybody who wants to give it a try? If I talk about EU, AU declarations or statements, who actually is going to do that? At which political level do we find this kind of interaction? Anybody wants to give it a try? Yeah, please. Vous pouvez aussi parler en français si vous voulez.
Ah, merci. Je pense que l'interlocuteur entre les deux institutions serait le président de la Commission de l'Union européenne et le représentant pour l'Union pour l'Union africaine, le président de la Commission. Et pour l'Union européenne, c'est la représentante ou le représentant qui est représentant, comment, comment on l'appelle, je suis un peu, je viens d'arriver. Oh, c'est le représentant de l'Union européenne, voilà. C'est son interlocuteur. Je trouve entre les deux institutions, l'Union européenne et l'Union africaine, c'est les deux institutions, représentants des institutions, à savoir le président de la Commission africaine et le président le représentant chargé des affaires extérieures de l'Union européenne. Voilà.
Yeah, very important. Our colleague has made a clear observation and said it would be the representatives of the respective unions. And that means you're looking at the bodies of those unions who can represent them externally. And here that is an interesting point. So in the European Union, who is representing the European Union externally? It was for a long time the presidency of the Council. In other words, we have a Council of Ministers, or 27 states, and they are rotating. So for a long time, every half year, you had another state taking the presidency of the Council, and then the relevant minister of that state would represent the European Union. So for example, nowadays, the presidency of the Council in the European Union is Ireland, and that would mean that internationally, if the foreign minister of Ireland speaks, he could say, on behalf of the European Union, following something on substance. But every half year a new boy or a new lady. And that is not very good for consecutive stability. And that is why, at a certain stage, inside the European Union decided, well, we need to change this system a bit, and we need to have a stable representative outside. And a stable representative should not come from a member state, but from the institution. And that is at the European Union level, we have the highest level, states are represented by their presidents, heads of states, or their prime ministers, so heads of states of government. And these heads of state of government elect a president of the European Council. And he is then representing the European Union at his level. Yeah, the president of the European Union at his level for the areas of foreign policy. And then we have, at the same time, we have another very important institution at the EU, that is the European Commission. European Commission is more like an executive body, where you have commissioners from all the member states, but they are not under instructions. They are independent, and they run the European Commission officials, the executive body in the European Union. And there the president is elected for 5 years. President currently, does anybody know who's the president of European Commission right now? Yes, sir? Yes, Mrs. Ursula von der Leyen from Germany. Yeah, so she's elected 5 years, and she's in her second term already. Yeah. So we have the representatives of the institutions, President of the European Council and of the European Commission. Now, put yourself into the shoes of the Prime Minister of a member state. For example, you're the Prime Minister of Spain. And then you see there would be a summit with the European Union and the African Union. Would you be happy to be sidelined and say, well, these two guys there, they speak for the EU, but I'm not even there? Well, it's on. Can you hear me? Yeah. So from the perspective of member states, that system is, let's say, a little bit shaky, because if you only have the two representatives of the union speaking, you may not even be in the room. And you may not even participate in the dialogue. That's also not ideal, and that is why what we do is normally we say, okay, at the level, we will also invite all the relevant representatives of the member states. So at the end of the day, what happens is you will have the ministers of the member states and the relevant representative of the institutions together in the room. But the formal position of external representation should be delivered by either European Council or the European Commission. It's a bit complicated to understand, but this is how it works, and therefore that I want to explain to you. Then we have the three levels. Either we go to the highest level, that is indeed the heads of states and governments, which we've just discussed, but you can also go lower. You can go at the level of the foreign ministers, and here the question is, who's then the foreign minister of the European Union? Yeah, we had the European Council President and President von der Leyen. They are at the heads of states level, but at the foreign ministers level, there is another person, which the colleague has mentioned in his correct intervention. It's called the High Representative for External Relations and Security Policy. This is currently Mrs. Callas, yeah, and we have European commissioners, the Commissioner for Trade or Commissioner for International Cooperation. So they are at the level of the ministers, and below that you can also have, of course, the possibility to meet at the level of the officials, and that means that we can also have an exchange between the directors of the foreign affairs and so on and so on, and also between the secretariats with the African Commission involved. So this is all to explain to you that we have quite a strong link between the different levels, and the summit declaration is the top political document, is the reference point which then will inform also the day-to-day business if we come to talk to each other. What about parliaments? Do you think it is important that also parliamentarians speak to each other? Because currently I was only referring to governments, right? What do you think? International relations normally is government business, right? So is there a purpose that also parliaments would interact? What would that add? Add confusion? Any views on that? Yeah, please.
Yes, I mean, it's important that parliamentarians also give views, because EU foreign policy is shaped by different member states. For instance, when the EU was trying to consider the action on Palestine against Israel, different members of parliament, different MEPs gave their positions according to their countries, and in the end, the Commission and the Council had to take a decision. But the arguments of the opinions of the members of parliament are very important, although they don't give the final say. But it's important that they give the views of their respective countries and the voters that they represent.
So that was a passionate plea for parliamentary participation. Parliamentarians may have a slightly different view, maybe more outspoken. So diplomats are used to be very, very careful not to create problems. But parliamentarians would speak their minds, and they have also the legitimacy of being voted directly by their peoples. They can say, we represent the peoples, and if we have an issue with something, we also want to talk about it. And we control our government. If we don't like what the government is saying, we can act as a counterweight, and next time, if the majorities change, there may be a new government. So why not also having the parliamentarians interact? And this is, I think, an important point in our joint endeavor here, is that there are inter-parliamentary meetings between the European Parliament, directly voted, we have a directly voted European Parliament, and the Pan-African Parliament on a regular basis, and they also exchange point of views and may adopt declarations. Yeah? So while we are going to screen and analyze the declaration of the 7th summit, executive level, don't forget there is also a parliamentary part of it which broadly is in line, but there may be sometimes certain nuances. And having said this, I want to finish my little introduction on that one with a distinction which we need to do. When we talk about EU-African Union relations, we do not talk about something else which is also very important for the continent, and that is the EU-ACP, African, Caribbean, Pacific cooperation, and we need to distinguish that. Can somebody explain to me what is the ACP, the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States? Where does it come from, and how does that relate to African Union? Maybe we have a specialist here who knows something about the ACP, African, Caribbean, and Pacific Organization. Anybody who wants to give a try? No, if that's not the case, then I'm happy to explain to you. So we need to look into the historical evolution also on the EU side. On the African Union side, we know the predecessor 63 and then 2000. On the European Union side, in the beginning the community was founded in the 1950s. And at that time there was one or two colonial powers who were founding members, France and Belgium. And they still had, of course, their views, and sometimes they even held still colonies at the time. And in the 1960s, the question came up, what do we do with the former colonies? Yeah, so in the wave of independence, late 50s, beginning of the 60s, some of the newly independent states would still have special relations to their former colonial powers. How does that relate into a relation with the European Union, to which France and Belgium were a member? Well, naturally, these two member states were saying, we also want to make sure that the European Union has special relations to our former colonies. And that translated into some sort of a policy to adopt or offer association agreements with these countries. So in the 1960s you will see that, first association agreements. And then in the 1970s something happened, very importantly. The European communities themselves became bigger. We had new members in the European community. Most importantly, 1972, which member states came new into the business? Yeah, that's a little bit EU history, but I think very important. The United Kingdom, 1972, 1973, becomes a member of the then European community. And the UK had a similar idea. It said, look, we do not only want to have privileged relations to the former Belgian and French colonies, but also to ours. So let's bring this together in a new approach. And this meant that the European Union started to say, okay, let's approach this entire group together under the name of ACP countries, African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries, and let's offer them a specific association. And this happened in 1975 in the so-called Lomé I agreement. And I have to cut it a little bit short. Yeah, Lomé I became then renewed, Lomé II, 3, 4, every 5 years. And later on it was then translated into a new name that was becoming the Cotonou Agreement. And nowadays, the latest version of this is the Samoa Agreement. And Samoa Agreement was signed in 2023 and started provisional application in 2024. And what is important is that many African states are also part of this group, right? So they are members both in the African Union, to which we have relations, but they are also members of the Organization of African, Caribbean, Pacific States, which sometimes is a little bit more complicated legally, yeah, to see where we are. But I wanted to make this point in the beginning because when we talk about some issues such as trade, they are by the ACP history, not so much by the African Union. It may change in the future, but for the time being, this is clearly influenced by the Samoa. Okay, so this. Let's now turn to the seventh declaration. I would kindly ask you to try to find it on your phones. If you can put up declaration of the African Union and the European Union of the 7th Summit. You can find it if you go to the website of the European Council, so Concilium Europa EU, and then you will find the 7th declaration. I give you a little bit of time to find it on your screen, and then we want to go into business. It's not a treaty, it's a declaration of the summit, but it is quite important in order to understand what is currently happening on the EU-AU side. And if somebody has it, please let me know, then I can continue. Yeah. So Elvis, did you find it? Joint declaration, exactly. That's the point. Excellent. Yeah. So maybe you can just read out the first phrase, and then I will stop you. Yeah.
All right. So the 7th African Union, AU, European Union, EU Summit Joint Declaration. We, the heads of states and government of the member states of the African Union, AU, and the European Union, EU, met on 24th to 25th November 2025 in Luanda under the co-chairmanship of His Excellency Mr. João Manuel Gonçalves Lorenzo, President of the Republic of Angola and Chairperson of the African Union, and His Excellency Mr. Antonio Costa, President of the European Council, with His Excellency Mamadou Hali Yusuf, Chairperson of the AU Commission, and Her Excellency Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission, for the 7th Summit. This historical gathering marked the 25th anniversary of the AU-EU partnership since the inaugural summit held in 2000 in Cairo.
Thanks a lot. So this sounds very innocent, yeah, but for the lawyer, it must have been crafted by lawyers. Why? Because they had to get the representation right. Who is meeting there and with which kind of capacities? Yeah? So we, the heads of state and governments of the member states of the African Union and the European Union. So the member states were all there. Okay? Member states of the African Union and the European Union met, and now comes one of the key words, under the co-chairmanship. Very important. What does it tell us? It tells us there's complete equality, co-chairmanship. There are two chairmen who are both running the meeting. Yeah? But the chairmen are not the heads of states of any of those member states. But the chairmen represent the relevant international persons, namely the African Union and the European Union. And here it's what I said in the beginning. So, for the European Union, the chairperson, well, that's for you to decide. You decided this should be the President of the Republic of Angola, so the one who is the host. Fine. Decision of the African Union, the host of the meeting should represent us. But at the EU side, it's Mr. Costa, the President of the European Council, which is an institution of the European Union. So these are the two co-chairs. And this is also interesting, with the chairperson of the EU Commission and von der Leyen. So this is something like, okay, they are also there, they also have a role, yeah? And this has to do with the European Union external representation, because Costa can only represent on foreign policy, whereas von der Leyen represents on all the rest. But okay, that's a little detail, but von der Leyen is also mentioned expressly next to Costa, yeah? And with the chairperson of the EU Commission. So, we understand how that works, so they are gathering all together in this interesting legal formula, and then they adopt this kind of declaration. Declaration, you will see, consists of 49 points, fairly impressive number of points, and very dense also. There is not so much blah blah in it. Yeah, it is quite to the point on many issues. So we could use many hours to go through, but what I try to do now with you is to focus on the main deliverables here. And therefore, the first thing, if we want to look a little bit at the structure, what we find out, if you look at the overall, there is an introduction of the first 7 points, and then you have 4 headlines, right? First headline is Shaping a Prosperous and Sustainable Future for Africa and Europe. That is paragraphs 8 following, and it is clearly the longest one. Yeah? So it goes from 8 to 21. And legally speaking, it is nothing spectacular. It's a declaration, so it's not legally binding, but it is priority number 1. Yeah? There is a choice behind it. What do you put at the beginning of your document? And you start with priority number 1, and that is shaping a prosperous and sustainable future. It shows you the easiest and probably the most fruitful where we have cooperation is in the area of economic development and prosperity. But it's not everything. It's not only about this issue. We have the second priority, and that is also quite interesting. Second priority is already in the next headline before para 22, a renewed and enhanced cooperation on peace, security, and governance. Why is that important? If you look at security in Europe, what is the main organization which has been dealing with security? Was it the European Union? Or is there somebody else also hosted in Brussels? But not the European Union? Or yeah, you will certainly know about it. So, which it was the main security organization for Europe, and we can say still is? NATO, right. Yeah, explain why. Can you tell me why?
I would think because the member states of the European Union have delegated this responsibility to NATO. North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Atlantic, yeah. The US is there, that's not part of the EU. Yeah.
Just, very good. So, North Atlantic Treaty Organization was the prime security because the United States was a member, as is still today, although Mr. Trump from time to time says, I'm not so sure, but they are the most important member of NATO, together with Canada, North Atlantic, and Western Europe. Now we need to understand was founded in 49 against the Soviet Union. Soviet Union was seen as a threat, was trying to influence further down on the European continent, and the NATO was saying, we have to deter that and stop them, right? So the main security, and it was Judge Glady also said this morning, was collective defense, organizing collective defense against a future Soviet threat. And therefore, most of the military spending, the military integration, everything was organized within NATO. And also, after 1990, after the end of the Cold War, if there was a military engagement outside, such as Kosovo, who was involved? NATO, but not the European Union, right? Okay, so, seen from that perspective, it is quite interesting that now, 2026, we have a document which says the second priority between the EU and the African Union is about peace and security. And we're going to discuss this further. What does it mean? Okay? What is the third priority? If we look at the third headline, somebody found the document, maybe can read it out. It is before paragraph 30. Yes, please. Yeah.
Stronger commitment to multilateralism.
Okay, and what would you understand under this? What kind of topics would we discuss under this?
I guess like making sure that everybody can work together and the powers are kind of, there's not one that's kind of overpowering one another.
Yeah, that's about the respect and the mutual, let's say, how we work together. But the word multilateralism would also point to an additional dimension. So not only how do we ourselves interact, but how do we interact together with others, right?
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. In other words, in other international organizations, what do we do together in the UN, for example, or in the WTO, or in whatever other multilateral forum like the G20? Is there something like a common European African approach to a certain problem, if I may say so? And then we bring this together inside an international organization which is broader than EU Africa, right? So how do we cooperate together in the broader world? Yeah? And then we have the fourth and also important priority, and who wants to paragraph 40? Yes, please. Yeah, lady here. Mm-hmm.
An enhanced and reciprocal partnership for migration and mobility.
And what would you expect under this heading?
And this is the how EU and AU are going to cooperate in dealing with migration and the movement of people, whether those who are just moving, those who are running out of maybe some conflict, maybe those who are being persecuted, etc.
Very good. Yeah, so it's a very pressing issue. How do you reply as a politician to the fact that there are migration and sometimes mass movements ongoing? From European perspective, a lot of migrants trying to go to Europe by different routes. And from African perspective, also the problem that maybe you lose people who are highly educated, but they may get a better job outside, and then they are lacking for your own economic development. So it's quite an important topic. And this is therefore tackled in the fourth priority. And then there is a little bit at the end, implementation and follow-up. That's not so important for us. So, having understood this, I think, let's then go into the substance. Yeah, let's try to understand what is meant particular areas, and let's start with priority number 1. That is, please, Judge.
So I decided not to open the document and see if I could guess which would come. And one that I was expecting would be the third, didn't come, is the environment. I thought that it would be very important for both parties. Is it subsumed somewhere else, or is it just simply not there?
Yeah, I can reassure you the environment is there. It is in the first priority under prosperous and sustainable future. And it is one of the, let's say, the sub-priorities, if I may say so. And we have specific instruments and packages, and which I will come to now under the first priority. So let's up paras 8 following. And for pedagogical reason, I will not start with 8, but with 9. 9, 10, and 11 are basically about trade. Yeah. So if we want to sum it up, para 9 is let's try to strengthen and diversify, diversify experts and integrate into region markets. There's mention of the African Continental Free Trade Area, which you have already discussed. I'm not going to repeat it. Then there is in para 10 maybe a sentence which is hard to understand, and I will quote it. In order to facilitate trade, we stress the importance of maintaining open, transparent, inclusive channels of dialogue, okay, including on trade-related environmental measures, such as CBAM and EUDR. Does anybody understand that? Yeah? It's the heads of state of governments who must be very intelligent because they speak a language that nobody else understands. Yeah? It's, I would say, a mistake. Yeah? You should at least spell out these kind of things before you use an abbreviation, but this can sometimes happen. So what do they mean here? I say, we want to stress the importance of an open trade and trade-related environmental measures such as CBAM and EUDR. Well, okay. So, CBAM stands for Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, and in plain words, it means that the European Union operates inside its internal market a system where you have to pay if you want to make large emissions. Polluter pays principle. So if you are a steel factory and you have very large emissions to produce your steel, you have to pay a certain amount to the government to be allowed to do that. Why? In order to have a clear price on the carbon emissions, and that should reduce the carbon emissions over long term. Because if you are very, very dirty, you have to pay a lot, and then you get probably not very successful on the market, and you better stop it. Or you improve the way on how you are going to produce it with less carbon emissions. That's the whole idea. Okay, so we have a carbon emission system, but this operates only in Europe, and rightly so, because we only have jurisdiction over our own territory. But now imagine you import steel from another country into Europe. Let's say not, maybe most African states would export steel, but let's say India, with a lot of steel makers. And there is an Indian steel maker who exports to the European Union, and they don't have to pay the emission fee. What happens at the market? European customer would buy the cheaper imported steel from India. the European producer would say that's unfair. I have to pay an emission fee because I'm in Europe and this importer does not have to. Solution, what the European Union does is to impose at the border a fee which is equivalent to the internal one. So the Indian exporter has to pay at the border an equivalent fee according to the emissions they have used when producing the steel in India. And that's the CBAM. From an EU perspective, very logical to have fair competition between those who sell steel in Europe. From the perspective of India, not so fair, because after all it's their own decision whether or not they impose certain environmental conditions on the production of steel in India, right? And this is why these are considered, and that's a technical term, environment-related trade instrument. Yeah, it regulates trade at the border because of an environmental purpose. And it restricts the Indian trade because they have to pay the fee. And what the declaration here simply says, watch out that you don't overdo it. It's a dangerous instrument if you make everybody who wants to import into Europe basically conditioning on more or less the same conditions that exist in Europe. It's not more and not less, but it's a warning sign. Yeah? The same for the same thing, the second expression. So the first was CBAM, and the other one was EUDR. Yeah? EUDR stands for EU Deforestation Regulation. EU Deforestation Regulation. Can anybody have an idea what this is all about? Yeah, yeah. It's another point in EU legislation. Very recently, the Parliament and the Council adopted a regulation which says, if you want to import wood products into the European Union, you have to show via a certificate that the wood was not produced in the exporting country by means of illegal deforestation. In other words, yeah, if the wood is come from a country where there is not much law enforcement and where large, let's say, illegal logging goes on, yeah, the exporters can gain a lot of money by exporting it to the EU, but maybe the EU consumer doesn't want to have wood from deforestation because they think we need the forests to keep the climate alive. So what the EU then is doing is saying we are asking those who come with this wood from foreign countries to show us that they are clean, that they have not used illegal deforestation. Again, an environmental motive, but it may have an impact on trade. And that is why it's called environment-related instrument. And here the declaration says, look, we understand that you are doing it, but defining how much you go, what is illegal deforestation, how much do you have to explain, the bureaucratic amount, all of this needs to be somehow proportionate. It's a warning sign, right? Okay, so in other words, here the African countries, and I'm sure it comes from their request, says, you be careful. Sometimes you do these kind of trade-related instruments, but don't overdo it. And then comes 11, and in 11 it says, we stress that the increasing uncertainty in trade policies and tariff volatility in global trade poses a challenge. So in diplomatic terms, who is meant here? Can somebody say in plain language, for example, if you're an MP, a parliamentarian, would you say uncertainty in trade policies and tariff volatility in global trade is a challenge? What does it mean? Well, it means the tariffs coming from the White House are a problem. Okay? Yeah? But that's diplomacy, right? You say, okay, we don't like them. They create uncertainty, they are probably not correct, Yeah, their compatibility with WTO is unclear, or at least very open to debate. So this is a problem. Whether it's not named by name, but it is in diplomatic terms, saying current US trade policy is a problem for both of us. So what do we do then? What is our reply? Well, it comes in the next sentence. So we try to remain a source of stability based on predictable frameworks and commitments to a rules-based trade. We commit to continue working based on trade and investment agreements between the EU and some African countries, as well as unilateral preference schemes. Okay, so we have it here. Trump administration is creating uncertainty. EU-Africa tries to remain stable on trade. And for that, we count on existing trade agreements and unilateral trade preferences. Can somebody tell me what are those famous existing trade agreements between EU and some African countries? Maybe from your own country you know one or two. You can maybe explain it. Yeah. Any example will go. Yes, please, monsieur.
Par exemple, des accords d'association passés entre des pays venant de l'Union africaine avec des pays venant de l'Union européenne. L'exemple, mon pays qui a passé un accord d'association avec, sinon c'est l'accord passé de l'Union européenne avec le Maroc, avec beaucoup de pays, la Tunisie aussi, puisque je venais.
Je vais expliquer dans une minute un peu plus. That's a very good example. Other examples for trade agreements, but maybe with African countries, southern of the Sahel. Any ideas? Yeah, have you heard about economic partnership agreements, EPAs? Yeah, you have a bar? Okay. So I will explain those two. Okay? So first we have association agreements with the African states in the northern part of the continent. This is part of a strategy which is called the Barcelona process. So all the Mediterranean countries basically try to be very strongly liaised with the European Union. Yeah, all the neighboring countries, they got a model agreement, an association agreement, which goes very far in terms of trade liberalization and will also include to a certain degree services. So they are the most advanced, and they are also trying to foresee a political side. On the basis of this, there has been also a movement to create, let's say, more trade in the Mediterranean. Association agreements since 2000, roughly. Yeah, the first initiatives were started in 1995 in Barcelona, and the first entry to force 1999, 2000. So long-standing for 25 years. All those North African states can be sure that they have very good access to to the European Union market. Then we have the EPAs, Economic Partnership Agreements. What is this? Here I come back to what I explained on the ACP, African, Caribbean, Pacific. So we have an overarching agreement, the Samoa Agreement, with all of those. But then the Union will say, well, we want to go regional. So the specific regions of the ACP cooperation, they should conclude with the European Union as a whole a free trade agreement, an FTA, which is then called an Economic Partnership Agreement. And technically speaking, what does the word free trade agreement tell us here? It's not only a political term, it's also a legal term. it goes a little bit too in the WTO, and I'll explain. If you are a member of the WTO, you are under an obligation as a state or as an organization to grant the same tariffs to all the other WTO members, which is called MFN, Most Favored Nation, Article 1 of the GATT. Now, if you want to give a preference to somebody, so the European Union says, I'm going to, let's say, levy 10% tariffs on the imports of tomatoes of everybody. But then you say, okay, but I have an understanding that country X needs to have a better tariff. I want to go down from 10 to 5. What does MFN mean? It means if you want to go down for one, you have to go down for all the others as well. Most favored nation. So you cannot differentiate. You need to keep it at the same for all. Only exception in the WTO is unless you create free trade agreement with these countries. Then you can differentiate. If you want to have a free trade agreement, then okay, you can go down for some, but not for everybody. And so the EPAs, the economic partnership agreements, are then construed as free trade agreements, and that means they need to cover substantially all trade with these countries, which is meaning 75% onwards. So the EPAs do have then a fairly broad kind of scope. And I can tell you we have, for example, an EPA with the Southern African Development Community, SADC. We have an interim EPA with Central Africa. There is a specific issue with Eastern Africa, Eastern African Community. There is an EPA which was negotiated, but we didn't get any further. And then Kenya went along and created its own EPA with the EU. Although Kenya is a member of the East African Community. Is there a legal problem here? Maybe somebody from Kenya or Uganda or Tanzania knows the case. So these countries have joined the East African Community, which says we want to have common trade. But then all of a sudden one member, namely Kenya, goes ahead and concludes an individual EPA with the EU. Well, if you are now Tanzania or Uganda, what do you think about that? Probably, yes, Elvis? Yeah? Okay.
So, sorry, okay, I'm not from either. I'm from Zambia, but I can give it a crack. So what happens is that it undermines the free trade that the benefits that Uganda, Kenya, and let's say the East African community was trying to achieve among themselves. Yeah, because when these goods reach Kenya, it will be difficult for Tanzania, Uganda to regulate them. Yeah. So in the end, it will force Uganda and Kenya and Tanzania to start fighting back on what they have agreed to start controlling the goods coming from Kenya. Because in the end, the EU goods will go everywhere anyway. Yeah, so it's either or everyone embraces that EPA, or Kenya backs away from the EPA and respects the agreement they have in the East African community.
Okay, so this was already a little bit of a pleading before a court. Yeah. And indeed, this, let's say, action of Kenya to have its own EPA with the EU was attacked before the East African Court of Justice, and I have the judgment. It's not a judgment, it's an interim order here, so I recommend reading it, at least for those of you who are from that region. And the Center for Law and Economic Policy based in Uganda brought a case, interim case, and said, more or less what Elvis has now argued, well, we think under the East African community, Kenya is bound to respect common trade rules, And by going ahead with an EPA with the EU, they are not honoring this commitment, and therefore it needs to be stopped. And interestingly, the court then in this interim decision said, well, there is a triable case here, and we understand that's quite an open and important issue, so we need to decide on the merits. But if we don't give an interim order right now, there could be irreparable damage. Therefore, we have the power to issue an interim order. Quite a substantive one, and therefore, since the interim order has been issued, the treaty should not be applied. I'm not going to take a position about the substance of the case. It's not my business. It's for the court. The Kenya has argued, but I am authorized to do that because in the East African community there is a provision about variable geometry. Whether or not that will be sufficient as a legal reasoning, we will see on the merits. But quite an interesting point here. Whether or not the East African community law prevails over this EPA action, and that would be a key also for future regional trade. If you want to face regional trade, everybody will look at this case for sure. Okay, good. So we have these agreements in force, and what is the nicety of them? They are stable. They cannot be just taken away. The tariff concessions that you have remain in place, and therefore it creates predictability for trade. And this is the key message here from the declaration. And then they mention also unilateral trade preferences. Can somebody explain to me what is this? A unilateral trade preference? When we compare this to a trade agreement, what's the key difference here? The word unilateral will already indicate a certain direction. What's the difference between a unilateral trade preference and a trade agreement? Yeah? Well, an agreement needs two, right? I agree on something. I agree that I am going to reduce my tariffs, and then in return, you do something for me. You also reduce your tariffs maybe on a different product. But it's a reciprocal thing normally, right? A unilateral trade concession is, I am going to decide on my own, unilaterally, to open up the market to you. Because I'm a nice guy, or I have some other motives. But I don't need your agreement for that. I just decided, because I'm a sovereign nation, I can decide which tariff I do, unilaterally. Okay, very good, very nice. But it also means it can be reversed anytime. If you have a new government which doesn't want to follow the previous government, it can also say, okay, end with this unilateral stuff, I'm going to do it differently. Okay? Now, if we look at the European Union, we have these unilateral trade concessions for one particular group of states, including many African states, and this is for the LDCs, the least developed countries. So those who qualify under the UN system as LDC, they are treated as specifically vulnerable, and that means that the EU is granting unilaterally free trade concessions, tariff reductions to zero for all those LDCs. And the only exception is export of arms. And therefore it has also a specific word. In literature it is referred to as everything but arms initiative. Legally speaking, you can find this in an EU regulation, which is the GSP regulation, General System of Preference Regulation. And this regulation is a unilateral EU act. Theoretically, it can be abolished. So a new parliament, together with the council, can abolish it. But the practice, the constant practice is that since 2000 we have always renewed it. Only difference is if you as an LDC, you make significant progress and leave the category of an LDC, then also you are not covered anymore by the GSP regulation. Okay? Good. So, declaration tells us also very good. We have stability because of the trade agreements, but we also count that the unilateral preference continue, roughly, right? Okay. So, I think with this we can leave a little bit the trade area on the text, and I just want to inform you that, of course, does it work in practice? Is it good enough or not? Well, I have a few figures to show that there is trade diversity ongoing. For example, South African exports of cars to the EU increased by more than 200%. That's quite something. Ghana's exports with semi-processed or prepared fruits reached now 16 million value in 2024, which is 4 times more than compared to the last 10 years. So we see a few concrete examples where this idea of more trade opportunities works very well. And the entire figures, currently 2024 figures, exports of Africa to the EU are more than 33% of Africa's total trade. So in other words, there is good momentum to intensify trade relations between your continent and ours. Now, let me go back in the declaration to something I wanted to discuss next. That's para 8. Still first priority. Para 8, if I have a volunteer who can tell me about that first sentence, can somebody please read out para 8, first sentence? Yeah, you have it? Yes? No, you.
Oh,
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Under the shaping a prosperous, that paragraph.
Para 8, first sentence,
Okay.
yes.
We welcome the significant progress in the implementation of the Global Gateway Africa-Europe Investment Package in areas of mutual interest, reflecting our shared commitment to inclusive, sustainable development.
Yeah, that's fine. Good. So there are a few keywords here, that colleague has just read out. The implementation of the Global Gateway Africa-Europe Investment Package. So we need to understand that. And another keyword here is reflecting the shared commitment to inclusive, sustainable development. Okay. First thing, inclusive sustainable development is a catchword for international lawyers. Yeah, what does it mean? Well, what do we want to say with that? Sustainable development, of course that you know, I guess. Yeah, sustainable development meaning allowing development which, yes, maybe over there, we want to explain what is sustainable development? No? Yeah, but sir, behind, yeah, please.
Without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs.
Yes, very good. And in which areas would that mean? Which kind of needs?
I think basic welfare factors, including the issue of equity in environment and other welfare issues. Yeah. Equity,
very good.
Basically equity issues. Yeah.
Yeah. Very good. So it's taking into account the interests of the future generations. And it goes beyond economy, right? It is normally, from European perspective, we would say sustainability includes economic, social, and environmental areas. Yeah? That you give to the next generation a world which is economically viable, socially, and also environmentally in a good shape. So that next generation as well. And then we added this little word, inclusive. Inclusive sustainable development. Well, what does that want to say? What is the additional weight of this little word? Inclusive meaning it should benefit the whole population, not just a few, the selected few in government or elsewhere. Inclusive, we should make an effort that the whole population participates. Yeah? So that's the purpose. And how do we achieve that? How do we achieve that? Well, there was this word, the Global Gateway Africa-Europe Investment Package. Wonderful. What is it? What is this? Have you ever heard about the Global Gateway, and what is it? Yeah, well, it's a European term, yeah, and I'm not surprised. That is the first time you may have heard about it. It's a European term which wants to say, okay, this is how we in Europe try to pool our money together, so public investment money from European funds, which we give to African governments, but also private investment. Yeah? So private investors who want to participate in EU African big projects can do so. And I can tell you just a few figures. Probably you simply have to believe them. Yeah, so we have 270 Global Gateway flagship projects worldwide, and more than half are in Africa. Yeah, and I've asked my colleagues to tell me a few examples. So, for example, in Tanzania here, there's a financing of a hydropower plant in Kakono, jointly with the French development organization. We have in Tunisia a very important high voltage electricity cable interconnection, energy in Ghana, solar plant, Rwanda, construction of a wholesale market, critical raw materials, roadmap, and so on, so on, so on. So this is classic development cooperation. Yeah, that has a new name, Global Gateway, because it wants to say we emphasize the connection, yeah, between the different countries also, and also we want to go into future-oriented projects. And this is, you have heard my examples, yeah, energy, solar energy, yeah, digital, yeah, future-oriented, that will hopefully be part of also the national development plans. And that brings us to a particular part in the energy field that is mentioned also in the declaration, paragraph 14. There it says we commit to continue strategic cooperation in the energy sector to a particular initiative so that at least 100 million people in Africa will have access to clean electricity by 2030. So clean energy, what is that? Renewable energy, solar, hydro, water, wind, and all of this. And there is a lot of European investment in the area. And I can tell you that's quite a big number here. In 2025, there is a campaign which has a funding of 15 billion to drive renewable energy projects in the continent. So also responding to the question of His Excellency Judge Tladi, clean energy, climate is really an important part of this global gateway. It's not just only the classical cooperation, build more roads, but it is future-oriented, energy-related projects. And with that, I can then also mention some more investment-related initiatives. The EU has also come up recently with sustainable investment facilitation agreements with Angola and Côte d'Ivoire. And we have also tried to bring more, let's say, support to the African Continental Free Trade Area with a dedicated initiative of 1.2 billion. So I sum up. If you look at this, priority number one, what you can probably bring home is partnership approach. You try to identify that on equal level what are the relevant objectives and instruments how you can get there. Traditionally, Europe will help by opening up markets and securing open trade. but there is also a very clear angle of future-oriented investment, also organizing private money. This is a little bit the new kid on the block, which we then dub the global gateway. Any questions on priority 1? Still open? No? Then I think I still have some 15 minutes and I go into priority number 2. Oh, sir, please, of course.
Hello. Sorry, on EPA, something
Yes.
on EPA. In my opinion, we have historically witnessed the relations of countries to countries as bilateral relations, but and the European Union demonstrated a very high level of multilateralism. So dealing with, as a group, EU as a group. But we are seeing some individual countries within EU forming partnership which goes beyond both multilateral and bilateral. And for the case of EPA, actually EPA frustrated more of countries like East Africa, for instance. Tanzania belonging to the least developing countries, Kenya belonging to developing country, and in so doing, negotiation had to follow the patterns of the level of development. So Kenya was saying, no, I can negotiate alone. And Tanzania saying, no, we need to negotiate as a region or as a bloc. And this frustrated a lot of negotiations on the economical benefits. I don't know what's your take on this.
Yeah, I think you point at a very relevant issue here. So we wish to negotiate with the regions as a whole, and we try to do so in good faith. And the problem with the East African community was that they could not agree on a common position, which was ambitious enough, to satisfy all of them. And therefore, over time, when the good faith approach with the East African community came to an end, there was then an understanding to say, okay, if Kenya wants to come along, they are welcome. But, as I said, I'm aware of the legal aspects in the African context. So if in the future the East African Court would decide this is not in line with the commitments that Kenya has taken under the East African community, we would have to review the situation. I don't think that it's up for the European Union to tell the African partner countries in which regional configuration they see themselves best. So it's for the court to enforce the rules, and then we'll take it from there. Yes, Elvis?
Also have a question on Global Gateway. Maybe the larger part would come under open discussion, but since we've already touched on Global Gateway, I can still bring the smaller part of it. In your experience, because there is this rhetoric that Global Gateway may not necessarily be there for the taking, but just to entice the partners to keep partnering with the EU, in the sense that since the launching of Global Gateway, which even the latest summit, which took place in Brussels in 2025, indicated that very little money has been given for what it was meant for. Of course, the argument of the EU is that the partners don't meet the criteria. Yeah, but from your experience, is it really true that partners don't meet the criteria, or is Global Gateway a dandling carrot that makes the donkey move faster? Thank you.
Yeah, look, Elvis, the implementation of a Global Gateway cannot be generalized. Yeah, so every project has its own merits, has its own criteria, and has its own partners. So I don't think there is any politics behind which would try to somehow influence this in a certain direction. But what we would do is, after a certain period, there's always an internal assessment of how successful is it. Yeah, where does the money really make the difference? And in these internal review mechanisms, if there is a doubt that the criteria are maybe too demanding or too in a way political, yeah, then there can be always then a readjustment for the next. But first we need to see how the implementation goes, what is the level of actual benefits arising from those projects, and then you can take this into account for designing the new ones. No? Yes, please.
You concern about the raising aspect, a very new aspect of compartmentation, or maybe I should say, about like Turkey Africa Summit, US Africa Summit, China, FOCAC, and TICAD 4.
Yeah.
Are you concerned? Is this going beyond multilateralism? Is it multilateralism? Is the role of bilateralism a problem to you?
Mm-hmm. I will talk about this later on. Yeah, we have a certain worry in one particular area, but if you allow me, I will reply to it in the next phase. Okay, let's still use the lady. Yeah, please.
Is the benefit of Africa EU partnership truly mutual? And how can we ensure that both Africa and Europe gain equal cooperation in areas like investment, trade, energy, and technology? Because sorry, I wrote it. I can't find it anymore. Because there are some African stakeholders that argue that there's no mutual benefit in Africa like the ones that Europe are getting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, mutual benefit. I would like to ask then the question back: well, what kind of benefit they are missing? Yeah, I mean, usually what we would argue in the Global Gateway project, what is happening is that there is a lot of European money pouring into a project, which then would be built, constructed. You have a new power plant, which creates clean energy. And then the question is, who is running the power plant? Yeah? Who earns the money from the actual operation? And there can be different views, and I don't know which example you may have in mind.
Basically, the main of the summit main aim was mutual benefit from in both parts, the African Union and the European Union. But as I said, there's like some investment create local jobs, like from Africa you get local jobs. And whether the trade relation allow African countries moving their exporting raw materials to producing finished goods. Mm-hmm. You get? Yeah. And yeah, that's all. And is the decision making, the decision that's made, is it equally shared in both parts of the countries, like in African Union? Is the decision equally shared? Yeah.
Okay, good. So there are a couple of areas in this question. So first is, would an investment create local jobs? I would say normally yes, unless there is very specific high-tech involved where you need also the know-how of companies coming from Europe. But normally the answer is clearly yes. It's part of the exercise to say we want to invest in an area together with the local population. Next question is, what about the trade opportunities where you say moving certain products into Europe? Is that really equal or beneficial? Well, here I have already said it's not a matter of tariffs anymore. Well, tariffs are quite reduced and for LDCs to zero, for others to rather low level. What is now important is what is the categories of exports that an African country can compete with on the European market. And here I have to be saying this is not a question of days. This is a question of know-how and also specialization. If there is no trade barrier, it does not mean automatically that tomorrow a lot of African trade goes into Europe. You have to build this up, and what the European Union is trying to do is to help in the diversification, to say, okay, it may work in areas where you are competitive, and we try to build up this, how to say, specialization in order to have also more trade coming from Africa to Europe. Okay, good. Now it's almost 20 past, and I think it's better we make a break and we turn to the remaining priorities in my minutes or the rule? Okay, so let's have 10 minutes break, and I see you back at 3:30, please. Start with the second part, and then we go along. Okay, so we would now turn to the second priority of the seventh joint declaration, and that was the security part. So paras 22 following. And again, what we try is to understand better the references, what is at stake here, what is meant with the different descriptions. And the beginning is fairly straightforward. Para 22 tells us, okay, we are happy that we talk, so we strengthen the dialogue, annual consultations, very good. 23 means the European Union gives a big applause to the African Union and how it operates its own peace and security architecture, the one that we have studied this morning. And there is quite a strong language about these inter-African architecture, which you will perfectly understand by just reading 23. But then it becomes a little bit more curious in 24. And 24 starts with the words, "We welcome various EU common security and defense policy engagements in Africa, the substantial military and security support through the European Peace Facility, including the long-standing and reliable EU contribution to African peace support operations." So that needs a little bit of explanation. So the first wording used here was the various EU common and security defense policy engagements in Africa. What do they have in mind? What is an EU common and security engagement in Africa? Is there somebody who has an idea? Are there somewhere EU military persons with an EU flag and sitting somewhere in a military facility and engaged on the ground? Is this what they mean, sir?
I don't know, but during the pirates in the eastern part of the Indian Ocean, I think there was a lot of involvement with the countries like UK, I think Netherlands, on the arresting some of the pirates, and also asking some of the African countries to accept the third party trial. So, because if you arrest a pirate, you were not allowed to prosecute. So I think there was a lot of, I think Kenya signed an agreement with the European Union. I don't know, how is it European Union or party of that, to be a third party trial. Some countries, I think, refused. And maybe that's the only thing I can remember. I don't know whether they were also using the UN hot pursuit resolution, the UN Security Council resolution on hot pursuit, and something. But also there have been a lot of common defense in the Indian Ocean. Of course, partly with the Americans' involvement, but the major players were the British and the Canadians.
Yeah, very good example. That was a reference to fighting the piracy in the Horn of Africa. It was an international effort, and the European Union played part of it by sending a specific mission to that part, and it is called Mission Atalanta, and it meant that the EU decided in Brussels to send ships to the area to combat the pirates, and with the authorization of the Security Council, meaning that if you can catch them, you actually take them out, and then the next question, as you have rightly said, what to do with the pirates? Yeah, to go closer, yeah, okay, sorry. And then the next question is what to do with the pirates once you have caught them. And here the idea was, okay, let's ask the bordering states whether they are ready to try them, with some EU support, of course. So there was an agreement on surrendering the pirates, but not all of the states in the region were ready to take them. But this is a very good example of a concrete operation with executive powers, where you actually intervene on the and are in a situation of fight against them. And this is one of the few examples where the EU will itself act in the area with its naval forces, using force against the pirates, but with an authorization of the UN. Okay, so that is a clear example of a CSDP, Common Security and Defense Policy Mission, CSDP mission, Atalanta. Is there more? What else can we think of? And indeed, you may be surprised to hear that currently we have 11 CSDP missions and operations in Africa. Not all of them are as high level as we just discussed, but there are many more, and they do not necessarily have to be executive, meaning with the power to engage, but they may have to do with something else which is equally important. That is capacity building. Yeah, capacity building means an African country will ask the European Union to help in building its own capacity in a certain security-related aspect. So we have, for example, a civilian crisis management operation with Libya, which helps to advise and train and mentoring Libyan authorities in the area of security. So very clearly, this is a very weak state authority right now, and it would be important to come up with capacity building. Same is in Somalia. We have a capacity building mission there, OICAP Somalia, also promoting rule of law. And I myself have been having the pleasure to see we have a training mission in Mozambique. So I was invited to Maputo one day, and I saw the EU training mission where the government says we want to have our regular army to be trained by European forces to be better equipped in the fight against Islamists in the north, right? And then the European Union would say, okay, we are ready to do that. We are ready to train you and assist you in how to deal with these kind of threats. And this is something which is not very largely known. This is also not huge figures of persons coming, but it is an important factor of creating stability in the country, because there is a joint interest that there is no spreading of the terrorist regime in the further than they currently have, right? Yeah, indeed. Beyond Rwanda involvement, says the colleague, and it's also in the interest of Maputo government to say, look, we have different sources. And we do not rely solely on Rwanda, because this can create maybe certain dependencies which are not good in the long run. And then in this kind of situation, the European Union would say, yes, we are ready to do that, and it means we finance that also. It's EU money which goes into the training of the army of Mozambique. Okay, so you understand that these are important parts of our policy here, and para 24 simply says, okay, please do that, and this should be supported through the European Peace Facility. That is a special fund, where we can find the relevant financing from member states to actually have these kind of military missions. And then comes an important point, which also links very well to this morning, and namely, fourth sentence says, we underline that the UN Charter accords the Security Council with the primary responsibility for maintaining international peace and security. Good. And underscore the importance of adequate, predictable, and sustainable financing for AU-led peace support operations acting under UN mandate. Now, you understand that? AU-led peace operations means those operations with the African Union itself has decided on the basis of its mandate, which we have discussed this morning. And then the question comes, who's financing that? If the Union is going to send a peacekeeping mission somewhere in its members, this costs a lot. And what this paragraph tells you here is part of the financing actually can come from Europe, which will give the money to the African Union, and the African Union can spend for its own intervention or peacekeeping, which is in line with the African Union Constitutive Act. So here Europe acts a little bit as a bank, right? It gives the money, but the African Union is in charge to operate it according to its own rules. And this is then needs to be in line with the UN, and that is why it says acting under UN mandate. And when the para 24 says that we underscore the importance of adequate, predictable, sustainable financing, means basically, please, Europe, prepare in your programming of how to use this money, that we as African Union, we have a regular need for these kind of operations, and this is a diplomatic appeal not to forget when there are other priorities in the world. Okay, so this is quite important, and now we come to an issue which is a little bit more difficult, and you will not find directly in the chapter on peace and security, and that is, what do we do as Europe and Africa together with the situation in Ukraine? So you will not find that in the chapter on peace and security, but you find one sentence, very short one, in para 5, and it says, guided by the principles of the UN Charter, we reiterate our unwavering support for a just, comprehensive, and lasting peace in Ukraine. So, what does that tell us diplomatically? What does this wording say, and what does it not say? Yes.
I don't know whether it applies, but I've seen the European transitional justice mechanisms, which is very elaborate, being copied, almost the same being used in DRC, especially in DRC, repeatedly many times for the DDR and the SSR, security sector reforms. Yeah.
And now turning to, yes, yeah. But here in this paragraph we're talking about the just, comprehensive, and lasting peace in Ukraine. So it takes word in Ukraine. Yeah, so we're not in DRC context, yeah, but it is just and comprehensive peace in Ukraine. Nothing wrong with it, huh? Just, vast and comprehensive is fine, and we want to have these kind of peace. But what does it not say? It does not say who's responsible, who started the war, what should happen in terms of accountability, right? All these questions are not touched. And as a diplomat, it will tell you, well, they are not touched because there's no agreement. Yeah, this is a joint declaration at the highest level of the heads of states and governments, where everybody needs to be giving its consent. So here we have just a very little formula that, okay, we want this to stop in a just and comprehensive manner, but it doesn't give you any clue about all the other very important questions involved. So there is a major, somehow, challenge here to bring the positions closer to each other. And I want to tell you that from EU perspective, this is not very satisfactory. And we also think that this should or could be revisited, in particular in recent years. I'm not sure how much this is reported here, but we have clear evidence that the Russian Federation has also recruited African nationals now to participate on the side of the Russian army against Ukraine with false promises. So they receive a promise that they can maybe study or work in the Russian Federation, and then they are sent to the front line. And if you know what happens in the front line, if you're not really trained, then your life may be very short. And that is a real issue, which shows that there is a need to revisit this point. So for European Union, it is worth to be much more outspoken and have this in mind. And against that background, I come back to what you have asked me this morning in the previous session. There is also a little bit of competition here ongoing. Yeah? So recently, the chairperson of the African Union Commission, Mr. Mahmoud Ali Yusuf, met the foreign minister of the Russian Federation, Mr. Lavrov. And they had high-level consultations in Addis Ababa and are trying to prepare the third Russia-Africa summit in Moscow in October. And, well, it's everybody's choice with whom to meet and how often and so on. But seen from Brussels, it's not a very wise choice at this moment in time to show up in Moscow, because from our perspective, Moscow is the clear aggressor against Ukraine, has the ambition to annex its neighbor and deny self-determination of a whole nation. And so this is something where really there is a dissent, right? It is seen in Brussels as a problematic development. And all the more so, we know that in some countries in Africa, the former Wagner group is very much involved. Today they call themselves the Russia-Africa Corps in the Central Sahel countries. And that's an additional sign of worry, right? If you know a little bit more about the details, how the Wagner group operates, total disregards of IHL, international humanitarian law, and also not very successful. So this is worrying for us. The presence of the Russia-Africa groups, the idea to have a summit with the Russians in Moscow under the current situations is certainly not something which would be good for strengthening of the security-related relations. So we also see that our own member states are now increasingly under attack. I'm not want to go too much into detail, but I think it's correct to say that there are more and more cyber attacks against European states coming from Russia. Cyber attacks against infrastructure, against IT systems, election interference, and so on and so on. So it's not just an issue related to Ukrainian people, but it's also an increasingly aggressive stance against EU member states. So, therefore, you will understand that in this kind of thing, one little paragraph about a just peace in Ukraine just shows the diplomatic disagreement that we have for the time being. And I hope to have put to your attention a few elements why this is worrying for us. Any other questions on priority number 2? Yes, please, Lewis. Yeah, please.
My question on this would be, on this Russia-Africa and how it conflicts the EU-Africa relations, would be maybe we need to reflect more. Are we at that level where we are supposed to have that discussion?
Yeah,
okay.
Please.
All right, thanks. We need to reflect more in this paradigm. Number one, the EU-Africa romance has lasted a long time, even before China and Russia came on the scene. For a long time, the former French colonies relied on the French to provide security and so forth. I don't want to go into conspiracies, but let's focus on where there is evidence where certain coup d'etats were sponsored by the French government. And the evidence was there. Like in Niger, no decision was made in Niger or Burkina Faso without the blessing of Paris. That's why France was kicked out, and eventually it affected the EU relations with Sahel, or rather the French-speaking of West Africa. Now, it is this that led these countries to bring in the Russians. Yeah, so it's good to put that in perspective, that for a long time, it wasn't the Russians, it was the French. But what did they do? And then, you remember that when Mali was attacked, Ukraine celebrated. So this also angered certain sections in Africa, because it was the Ukrainians who gave the intelligence to the terrorist groups or rebel groups in Mali. You see? So all these elements complicate having a common position between apartheid, the Russian role that Russia played to liberate countries like South Africa and Mozambique. But most recently, it is these elements I just mentioned. And I was supporting Ukraine, but Ukraine did not do itself a favor when it celebrated the attack on Mali. It was not the Wagner who were killed. It was ordinary Malians who were murdered. And Ukraine wrote on the Twitter that this is what you get for attacking us. For them, they were trying to refer to the Wagner group. But the Wagner group didn't lose a single member. It was the Malians who were killed. So it is difficult to find a common position to support Ukraine as a continent. So certain countries support Ukraine as individuals, but as a continent, as a bloc, it has been difficult because of these thorns you have to get out of the way. Thank you.
Together with my comment, in my opinion, when we talk about Ukraine, there are two important aspects that we need to consider first before naming Russia or whoever. So one is called Crimea factor. If you remember, the first attempt by the Europeans and Americans was to get Syria. So somewhat Syria failed, I want to say. Although we don't have Al-Assad in Syria, but I want to say the American mission in Syria failed miserably. Turkey was well involved because of the Kurds, who are also, the German knows better, actually Germans knows better about the Kurds' role in the south of Turkey. But in my opinion, the whole saga is about what we call the Persian Gulf fight for oil and whatever that they have. So the Kuwait, Iraq, Syria first, Iran now. So it's the same. You cannot separate this discussion. So in my opinion, the British especially sponsored a lot of influence on the human rights activists in Ukraine to get rid of the president, a former president actually. Then when this president fled to Russia, Russia blocked Crimea. And Crimea was a source of gas for the whole Europe. So if we want to talk about all these cycles, it's a fight between Russia and the Americans. Actually, I'm very unfortunate. EU is not fighting its own war. This is a America-Russia war over the Persian Gulf. So Iraq started, and then came, actually Lebanon started, Iraq, and then Kuwait, and then Syria, now Iran. So Ukraine is just a victim of circumstance, because even this decision to join EU was necessitated by trying to be closer to European Union, to be closer to Russia. So it's the fight over a Persian Gulf. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Now we go into world politics. All right. Yeah. Exactly. So I'm just the head of the legal department. So I'm not the advisor to the politicians, but I think a few points. First, on Alice's intervention, I do understand that for African Union to have a common position on Ukraine, it's very difficult because of the particularities in their own national situation. I fully get that. But my point here is to say these are important points for us in the European Union, which we ask for an assessment in its let's say, future-oriented way. So, who is responsible for the situation in the Sahel, in Mali, in Burkina Faso, and so on? You may be right. That has to do with the French past and the dissatisfaction from before, and then that these countries turned to the Russian side for help. What I'm just saying is not a good idea. Yeah, maybe you were dissatisfied with the French, but turning to the Russian in this kind of situation is simply not a good idea, and it will hamper clearly the relations with Europe, because we see much broader, that there is a real aggressive potential sitting in Moscow, and that needs to be taken into account. So I don't want to say that it comes from nothing, but it's for a future-oriented strategic approach. We think it's better to take this into account. Now, on the observation whether Ukraine and Crimea is something like a proxy war between the United States and Russian Federation, you can link, of course, much broader international politics, but what we see from a European perspective is that the decision of President Putin to annex Crimea was taken immediately after the removal of the former Ukrainian president Yanukovych. That was done in a time of weakness of the Ukrainian, where they could not fight themselves back against that, and then there was a camouflage with the so-called green men and self-determination of the province and so on. And I don't think that there was any trigger in the Near East or in US policy. It was done at a strategic level and prepared very well from the Russian Federation. And we have to say, the reply of the Western powers to the annexation of the Crimea was relatively weak. Yeah, there were a few sanctions, a few condemnations, but otherwise business as usual. And that may have also encouraged Moscow to go broader and to prepare the next step, which is the annexation of the Donbass. And the Donbass has not so much to do with the Middle East, it has to do with the minerals in Donbass themselves. It's a very rich part of Ukraine. But if you see the justification of the Russian Federation, it has also to do with the reading of their own history, denying the Ukrainian nation a right to self-determination, saying, in reality, you are Russians. In reality, you belong to us. And that kind of narrative has nothing to do with Near East. This has to do with national history, and I would say Russian imperialism, and therefore this is why we see it a threat. Russian imperialism will not only turn against Ukraine, it can also turn against the former Baltic countries, which are Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia. No Middle East oil, American interests involved. This we see very clearly, very drastically, that this is a dangerous part of Russian imperialism, while not denying that the American and Russian interests clash many times, and that the Washington policy is important to understand Ukrainian problem. But I think the motivation of the Kremlin goes much beyond that. So, these were my little political additions, but I'm very happy to discuss the Ukrainian case. Okay, so I think here we went through the peace and security chapter. You understood where we are on the same page, CSDP mission and so on, but there is quite a difference on Ukraine. Now, we can turn to multilateralism. That's point number 3 of our priorities. And the colleague who had kindly read it ours before the break already brought us to the right angle here, saying this is about how to work together in international organizations. And mind you, we have 27 EU states, and we have an African Union more than double, or roughly. And together, how many votes would we have? So EU, in terms of percentage, almost 40%. So, if you know that in the General Assembly majorities count, just imagine for a second there would be a joint EU-AU position on a matter in the General Assembly, would be quite a force. So there is interest in saying let's reach out early on a lot of UN-related matters. If we can join forces, we can make a difference. And that is something which, of course, a nice wish, because we know that in practice it is very difficult to get there, but at least our leaders have said in clearly quite straightforward terms, and I quote para 30, we agree to work towards more converging positions in multilateral fora to ensure an effective multilateral system with the UN at its core, based on international law and true to the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. Wow, I mean, that's quite strong language. And mind you, what had come just before, I mean, not a few days, but who else thought about the UN and came to a completely different conclusion? President Trump. Because Trump has put forward the idea of an international board of peace as an alternative to the UN, right? And he has tried to assemble a couple of leaders to support that. That's not something that Europe would go with, yeah? So we are clearly saying no, in these kind of times, we need to stick to the UN as the system we have. The purposes of the principles of the UN Charter are the right ones. We don't need to revisit them. Yeah, we just need to make them effective, and then it comes, we reiterate our call for a more representative, inclusive, transparent, and accountable UN Security Council. Yeah, okay. Reality will show us that UN reform is hard to achieve, but there are the little steps, justifications, before giving a veto, maybe some sort of accountability in terms of judicial review and so on and so on. An accountable UN Security Council. Interesting word, huh? An accountable UN Security Council. This is what is the common EU-AU position on the matter. And, of course, we welcome cooperation of both unions as full members within the G20. And there's a lot about WTO reform and also reform of the financial institutions. Why that? What is the problem here with the financial institutions? Can somebody help me? Well, because there is still an over-representation of the Western powers in the World Bank and the IMF and so on, and that is a long-standing request from inter alia African but also other nations to have more representation there, and at least here is a recognition that this is a legitimate request, and there is also a commitment of fighting the global climate change and going into that direction together, because Africa can win a lot. From the clean transition, you can be the leaders of renewable energy technology, how it can be applied, and so on and so on. So there is an issue where we really work together and also trying to fight the dangers for the biological diversity, desertification, and all of this. I think Europe stands behind all these aims, doing this with a strong UN, UNEP, and Nairobi, and so on and so on. This is clearly a matter where we see eye to eye. Any question on multilateralism? No? Then I can turn to point 4, which is migration and mobility. Well, this is also quite an important and difficult topic. Yes? Yeah.
I had asked about which way to go now.
Yes.
Do you still believe multilateralism is the way to go, squashing or putting away the role of multilateral or nationalism, or I don't know, statecraft?
Yeah.
So, and with the advent of these now multilateral plus.
Yeah. So multilateralism traditionally meant working together in the multilateral fora. Yeah, trying to find common ground in the UN General Assembly, in the World Bank, IMF institutions, in WTO, and so on. But the problem with these institutions may be linked to their decision making. If decision making in these institutions is by consensus, and consensus is very hard to achieve, you see nothing is working in the WTO. It is very hard to get, consensus in the G20. And so what do you do then as an alternative? And what we see from a Brussels perspective is to say, let us try to work with those who feel a similar sense of responsibility for the international system, and identify them and then approach them bilaterally, but not necessarily nation to nation. I mean, EU already is 27, right? But we may be ready to say, let's talk to those who are willing to go forward, even though they are not in the classical multilateral forum, when the classical multilateral forum is blocked by consensus. I think that's the situation, and that explains why you have all those different fora right now. I mean, there are so many consultations going on, and it's time to review also how the multilateral system itself works, and this is something where I don't have a solution. I can just observe. That's a reaction. Judge, please.
Yeah. So if I can make an observation on that point, so I don't think all of these formations are in competition with multilateralism. So ultimately, I think the aim is always to influence what happens at organizations like the United Nations. So the consensus as a thing that blocks can easily be overcome. Look at majority. I mean, consensus does not mean unanimity. So if there's a large block of states that have a very strong position on an issue, which strong position may have been formed either at these EU-AU summits, or that large block can easily influence, and I think that's the point. It can easily influence decision-making in the United Nations. I don't think the problem is consensus, in fact. I think the problem is that even in these other forums, the agreements that are reached are very nice, but they're not very concrete, right? And so, for example, you spoke about UN Security Council reform and the 4 things that you mentioned. Everybody agrees about that. Now the question is, let's put it into practice. What does that mean for you in Security Council reform? And then suddenly we have very different bilateral forum. These bodies that seem to have a common position when the declaration was adopted, now suddenly they have different views, and they can both say this is consistent with paragraph, I think it was 30, right? And that's the issue then. I think it's still a valuable process because that's how you build consensus, right? You build consensus from abstract principles and abstract rules, and then you come, hopefully, you can at some point arrive at something that's a little more concrete. Just an observation.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Judge Zulati. Yeah, the diplomacy is the art of finding consensus on a certain abstract level. But the more concrete it gets, the more difficult. And that this is what I see also in my daily work. Okay, so let's go back to priority number 4, migration and mobility. We have already mentioned that before the break, and here we see a couple of important principles. So para 40 is the opening one, so there should be a dialogue about the matter and practices which are in full respect of international law and human rights. So that's the first thing. So Europe likes to recall this. What we have, the human rights-based approach to migration management. Yeah? While there are many different challenges, still Geneva Convention or Refugee Conventions cannot be put aside like that. There needs always to be a very careful application of the principles when we talk about fleeing countries for grounds which are recognized in Geneva Convention. At the same time, if you have economic migration, which is not based on the Geneva Convention, then the European Union would say, well, for legal economic migration, you also need to pursue the legal pathways. So cannot just be illegal migration, border crossing by force, migrant smuggling, trafficking, and so on and so on. So that's the borderline where the things become very difficult. And there is recognition that one cannot do it alone. So a proper border management also means proper cooperation between the countries involved. And that is why we have now 10% of the funds that we earmark under the relevant regulation, the NDICI regulation, goes to projects related to migration. So you see that as a new priority. 10% of all EU development cooperation money goes to migration policies. Quite a clear point. But it's not only Europe's interests to say, okay, let's organize this in a proper way. There is also exchanges, and we have mobility partnerships, and I can quote you a couple of figures here. So since 2022, there have been exchanges with over 30,000 African students who could go to Europe legally, and 18,000 Europeans to Africa. So roughly 30,000 to 18,000 both ways. And that comes on top of scholarships provided by member states. And the EU has funded 6,000 mobility opportunities for 103 African universities. And I've been extremely happy to see that there is also a network of universities from both sides. So there is a European Universities Initiative together with a couple of African ones. So Casablanca, Dakar, Johannesburg, Makerere in Uganda, Mozambique, and University of Sfax, together with leading universities in Europe, such as Bruxelles, Glasgow, Lausanne, and others. So what we try is to bring universities together, also to have these mobility partnerships, and stress the education which is involved for both. And that's also, I have to say personally, one of the reasons I'm here. I'm happy to see the African Academy is investing in education of brilliant minds in Africa, and we want to support that. We want to see good Africans to have the highest access to education as possible, and that's why I'm really super grateful to the organizers of this academy to do so. Okay, and I have received a quiet sign that I should. So I cannot close without saying something on human rights. Oh, I see a person. Yeah, please, you have a question. Yes?
First of all, thank you very much, Professor, for a very good presentation. But during your presentation, I had to involve myself through paragraph 24.
Oh, yeah?
Which was all about common security and defense policy, if I'm not mistaking myself.
Yeah.
But also to the last part, which was about migration and mobilities. Now, to begin with common security and defense policy, having reading paragraph 24, and I'm joining hands with my two colleagues, Len brothers, who have been asking questions about Ukraine and other parts of the world. We Africans, we are having something known as the third world approaches to international law, the 12, which make us focus and sometimes think more about these international laws and how do they apply, including the European Union. Now, in terms of peace and security, it has been developing into our minds that we are playing a certain match which has been crafted by other people, has been molded by other people. I'm trying to give you an example. A country of DRC Congo has been engaging into different wars. Somalia, the same story. Isn't European having created these stuffs, then going back trying to solve the problems? Because you can see the armed conflicts that are taking place, they are having very strong military equipment. And sometimes they are having a very skillful trainings to fight the government. Isn't that a part of your strategies? And coming back, trying to protect this government for your personal interests. That is what is bothering me. And sorry if I'm mistaken, but I have to ask this. And secondly, you have talked about the immigration and mobilities. And you said there are still many challenges, but you are very happy in terms of scholarships. There have been various scholarships, university engagement. It is also in my mind that is inter-European still selfish. How? You have been a very long time developed in terms of technology, industrial technology, and whatever, so on. But Africans, we still, at the grassroots levels, within that scholarship, isn't now the right time of now sharing us a piece of cake? At least we have those developments and maximum performance. At least we try even to trade with you for products that have not been produced in Africa. That's my question, please. Thank you very much.
No, thank you very much for bringing out these points, and I appreciate that. For a dialogue, it's also important to have critical questions. Huh? So we are not here to simply exchange niceties. So it's very important part of a mature dialogue to address these kind of differences. So on the first question about whether or not there are European powers involved in fueling the insurrection in some parts of African countries or not. I would not deny that outright hand, but what I have to say here as an EU official, it is not the policy of the European Union as such, meaning the 27 countries, which try to put together their common approaches. Yeah? So this is something which I think you need to try to understand, that European foreign policy is a very complicated thing. You have national foreign policies which are decided by national capitals, and then you have a European foreign policy which is the common denominator of the 27. And we as a whole, as 27, we would probably never engage in such a practice you've just mentioned. I will not deny that there may be national policy in some or the other countries, but they are not in the reach of the European Union as an organization. Yeah? It's not an excuse, but it's an explanation. Yeah? So what I'm here trying to represent is to say, okay, this is what everybody can agree to, the common objectives and common goals, but we cannot undo what national governments in their national capacity may in particular areas do or not do. And there is maybe also a joint responsibility about the arbitrary demarcation of today's borders, which have created additional problems, but on the other hand, this has been now, I think we have moved some 60, 70 years from there, and not every conflict today can be explained by arbitrary decisions of a long time in the past. Now, on the scholarship issue, and is it now self-serving or not? I think if you want to have a system of partnership, you try to respond correctly to the needs and legitimate requests of your partner. And if this involves the governments of partner countries will say, look, we want to make sure that some of our people get very high access to education by mobility partnerships, and Europe will try to do it. Is that satisfying the whole historical injustice done to the African continent? Probably not. But I think it's better than saying, well, I have nothing to do with education and mobility in Africa. It's not my problem, right? We try to come and getting closer. We cannot say all of a sudden we are best friends and every problem is solved. But it's the road and the bridges which are built today which can help for a better tomorrow. That's what would be my answer to your second critical question. And thanks again for raising it in public, because only by mature conversation we can continue. I have 2 minutes left, and then I would come to a close. And as I said, we are here in the African Court of Human Rights, and that is something which is very important. And I want to recall finally, there is paragraph 4 of the Joint Declaration. So it's not a priority, human rights not a priority, but it's there. And it says, we reaffirm our strong commitment to international order based on international law, effective multilateralism, grounded on international law, including the Charter, its purposes and principles, and there it comes, as well as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and international humanitarian law. I stress that because there are people these days who say human rights are not universal. Human rights are a product of a national or regional society, and they are different in Asia, in Africa, in Europe, or well. It's very important that all African leaders and European leaders say no to this thesis. There is a Universal Declaration drafted in '48 and accepted by all in the UN General Assembly, and parts of it are customary international law. And that is, I think, a very important also message, and I'm super happy to be in an institution here, which also a regional court, which will effectively enforce parts of the Universal Declaration and maybe some African nuances on people's rights, but still, the Universal Declaration is there to be defended, And I hope that we can do that together. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to be there tomorrow on another topic.
Very much, Prof. Wonderful presentation. Thank you. Very inspiring. Please let us give him more flowers. Thank you. So tomorrow we will continue at the same time at 9 a.m. Like we did today, please let us come on time. Like I said, the attendance is very important for us to get our certificates. And then don't forget the badges. And don't forget also to take our bottles, the empty bottles. And if there is water remaining, you can take that to your place because we don't have cleaners here. And the court has given us a privilege of using this for free. We haven't paid a single coin. Somebody forgot their diary. I don't know who that is. I haven't read what is inside, so that I don't know the secrets. But if no one comes, then I'll be obliged to open so that I find out the name of the person. And then I would like to appreciate and acknowledge the speakers of today. We have really benefited so much. I forgot today to give a recap, I think because we were disturbed.